The public is being conditioned to watch the skies for missiles. This is a strategic misdirection. The kinetic threat from a state facing systemic collapse is not a high-arc ballistic trajectory. It is silence. According to reports from CSIS, the most cost-effective asymmetric vector for a cornered regime is not nuclear, but infrastructural. The targets are not cities. The targets are the sub-oceanic fiber optic cables that function as the planet's central nervous system. A state like Iran, gripped by chaos and a severe economic downturn, does not need to match a carrier strike group. It only needs to sever a few key cables in the Strait of Hormuz or the Red Sea to trigger a global liquidity crisis. The secondary vector is satellite blinding, disrupting the GPS and communication relays that enable global commerce and military coordination. This protocol is designed to create a blind Leviathan, a superpower with unmatched firepower rendered inert. An aircraft carrier group without satellite data is a billion-dollar ghost ship. The New York Stock Exchange without data connectivity is a silent museum. This isn't warfare, it is systemic paralysis. When a regime is forced into a solvency trap, offering citizens the equivalent of $5 a month to prevent total unrest, the kinetic cost of this silent attack becomes its most rational expenditure. It is the mathematical endpoint of economic warfare. A state is not a nation. It is a balance sheet. The motive for escalation is not ideology, it is insolvency. When a state's liabilities, its domestic obligations, and its debts systemically exceed its assets, the regime faces a solvency crisis. Survival becomes a mathematical calculation. The protocol is visible in Iran. As the nation is gripped by chaos and economic downturn, its financial viability evaporates. Reports confirm the regime attempting to service its primary domestic liability, social unrest, with token payments of $5 a month. This is not governance. It is a terminal liquidity crisis. This is compounded by external pressures. As seen with the U.S. blockade forcing Venezuela toward economic collapse, the objective is to bankrupt the target. CSIS analysis confirms that a protracted, unpopular war functions as a liability accelerant, draining conventional assets and political capital. This weakness forces the pivot. The war is a solvency crisis. Once cornered, with no conventional assets remaining and facing internal collapse, a regime's most rational strategy is to weaponize its final liability, global pariah status. It converts international condemnation into leverage. The credible threat of kinetic or nuclear launch on warning becomes the only asset left on the balance sheet. Economic pressure is the direct vector for this asymmetric escalation. It is not a bug in the system, it is the protocol's intended function. The core calculation is the economics of lethality. A single main battle tank represents a capital expenditure of approximately $5 million. According to analysts at RUSI, the FPV drone that neutralizes it can cost $500. This is not a balanced exchange. It is an economic annihilation. The kinetic cost for the attacker has collapsed by a factor of 10,000. This is the new mathematics of warfare. This cost curve inversion is the critical leverage point. States under severe economic pressure, such as Iran, are gripped by chaos and a systemic downturn. When a regime is reduced to offering citizens the equivalent of $5 a month to prevent social unrest, It cannot sustain a conventional force structure. The solvency crisis becomes the primary vector for military transformation, forcing a pivot from expensive legacy assets to cheap, high-impact asymmetric systems. This phenomenon is termed the democratization of violence. It signals the collapse of the state's monopoly on high lethality force. Advanced kinetic capability, once the exclusive domain of superpower budgets, is now available at a consumer electronics price point. A cornered state facing economic collapse from a U.S. blockade does not simply surrender. It adopts the logic of the insurgent. It weaponizes affordability. Therefore, the financial blockade is not a pathway to peace. It is a calculated accelerant. By making conventional defense economically impossible, the protocol forces the target to escalate. The state must trade its most expensive asset, a standing army, for its most rational alternative, a launch-on-warning posture using asymmetric platforms. The economic pressure is the direct mechanism compelling the adversary to seek ultimate leverage, transforming a solvency crisis into a kinetic one. The primary battlefield is not geographic, it is systemic. The protocol to collapse a state financially is staged in what analysts at RUSI refer to as gray zones, seemingly stable regions selected to absorb and measure the initial shockwaves. This isn't random chaos, it's a controlled demolition. The evidence is in the state's balance sheet. Iran is now in a confirmed solvency crisis, offering citizens the equivalent of $5 a month to suppress unrest. This is not a policy failure. It is a mathematical certainty when a state is severed from the global liquidity architecture. Travel advisories issued by nations like India are external verifications of this internal collapse, signaling that the state can no longer guarantee basic security. This blueprint was field-tested. The U.S. blockade that triggered Venezuela's economic collapse was the template. However, the systemic blowback from these operations must be calibrated. This is the function of the gray zone. Regional instability, whether domestic housing crises flagged by officials like Powell or supply chain fractures in other G7 nations, are not the core problem. They are the monitored symptoms, the data points from the proxy laboratory. These zones act as staging areas to measure the kinetic cost of the financial attack vector. By observing the contagion in a controlled environment, the protocol can be refined. The objective is to push the target state, like Iran, precisely to the brink of asymmetric escalation, but no further. This is a game of leverage, converting a state's final liability, its sovereignty, into a final asset, a predictable, containable, kinetic event. The launch-on-warning doctrine is not a policy of aggression. It is a mathematical protocol of survival. The system is designed to execute a retaliatory nuclear strike upon detection of an incoming attack before the first enemy warhead can impact. The decision window is not hours or days. It is minutes. Its purpose is to guarantee a second strike capability, making a first strike a zero-sum act of mutual annihilation. This is the bedrock of deterrence theory. That protocol, however, was designed for an analog world. Today, its primary vulnerability is not the missile, but the sensor. According to analysts at RUSI, a sophisticated cyber attack can blind a nation's entire early warning infrastructure, satellites, ground-based radar, and command and control networks. This creates a critical intelligence vacuum, a total loss of situational awareness. This digital blindness creates the fog of digital war. For a state already pushed to the brink of a solvency crisis, like Iran or Venezuela, this scenario is a forced action trigger. Facing total economic collapse and internal chaos, the regime has no capacity to absorb a first strike and retaliate later. Its conventional assets are depleted. Its only remaining leverage is its ultimate liability, the nuclear arsenal. In this state of induced panic, the commander is forced to launch out of fear. The question is no longer, are we under attack? But can we afford to assume we are not? The protocol's logic becomes inescapable. Waiting for confirmation guarantees annihilation if the attack is real. Launching is the only perceived path to survival. Economic warfare creates the conditions where a simple cyber attack becomes the direct vector for kinetic and potentially nuclear escalation. A solvency trap is not a theory. It is a mathematical endpoint. Reports confirm Iran is gripped by chaos and a severe economic downturn, forcing desperate fiscal measures. This is the terminal phase of the financial weaponization protocol. When a regime's conventional assets are exhausted, its strategic calculus pivots from defense to asymmetric escalation. The state's ultimate liability, international condemnation, is then converted into its final leverage. The objective is no longer to win, but to increase the kinetic cost for its adversary, forcing a re-evaluation of the blockade. This is not an act of desperation. It is a rational, calculated signal to demonstrate capability and resolve. It is a calibration shot. The forecast, based on current accelerants and established doctrine analyzed by authorities like CSIS, is a non-kinetic, attribution impossible event against a U.S. logistics choke point. Within 12 months, expect a coordinated blackout of the Port of Los Angeles' digital infrastructure, a cascading failure of crane, container, and clearance systems triggered remotely. The disruption will be severe, the origin untraceable, and the message irrefutable. The solvency trap has been sprung.